No one could ever have predicted that that powerful man, accustomed to signing multi-million-dollar contracts, would make the most vulnerable decision of his life kneeling before a woman's grave, surrounded by three little girls who didn't even know who he was. And even more, no one would have imagined that in that moment he would reveal the secret he had kept even from himself. "I am your father." The silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind among the tombstones, was the backdrop for a revelation that would forever change the lives of Harper, Haley, and Hannah. Three identical sisters who, until that day, only knew they had lost their mother to a cruel disease, and who now discovered that the man with the serious yet tender gaze standing before them was, in fact, their biological father. The biting cold of late autumn in Rhode Island seemed incapable of freezing the torrent of emotions overwhelming Jackson Montgomery. Beside the three red-headed girls, so alike and yet so unknown to him until weeks ago, the Wall Street billionaire saw his world crumble and be reborn at the same time. He who had spent decades living under the rigid structure of spreadsheets, investments, and calculated decisions, now found himself defenseless, holding the fragile hands of his daughters, who gazed at him in silence, trying to process that monumental revelation. But this story didn't begin there at the edge of the grave, no. It began on the day Jackson, devastated by the loss of his wife Eleanor, saw three small figures hiding behind an oak tree during the funeral, watching him with an intensity he would never forget. At that moment, they were just strangers, mysterious and silent. But now they were his family. Before we dive deeply into this story full of unlikely encounters, painful decisions, and surprising transformations, take a deep breath and prepare yourself. What you're about to witness here is not just a tale of late-discovered fatherhood, but an intense emotional journey about how life can surprise us in the most unexpected moments, forcing us to reevaluate who we are and what truly matters. If you enjoy real and inspiring stories like this, full of twists and genuine emotions, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like. That way, you won't miss any of the upcoming narratives that might transform the way you see life and relationships. Now let's dive together into this story that, though it may seem like something out of a movie, is the purest reality. After Eleanor's burial, Jackson Montgomery could barely stand. The man who once commanded rooms full of investors, who never hesitated when making risky financial decisions, was now just a lonely widower, crushed by the weight of grief and absence. As the guests left, he noticed in the distance three small figures, girls around 8 years old, with red hair tied in perfectly aligned ponytails, wearing simple coats that stood out starkly against the sophistication of the funeral attire around them. The scene caught his attention immediately, not just because of the aesthetic oddity, but because of the synchronicity of their movements, the fixed gaze of the three in his direction, as if they already knew who he was. They stood there still motionless, like silent sentinels of fate. Before he could ask who they were or why they were there, the girls turned in unison and disappeared behind the oak tree, as if they were a mirage conjured by Jackson's own despair. That night in his Manhattan penthouse, surrounded by the deafening silence known only to the very wealthy, he couldn't think of anything but those three children. And for the first time in years, he ignored financial reports, set aside stocks and charts, to search for answers to something he couldn't name but felt was crucial. That's when he ordered Thomas, his loyal driver and trusted assistant, find out who those girls are. Thomas, accustomed to fulfilling his boss's unusual requests, didn't hesitate. And in less than 24 hours, he returned with a dossier that would bring Jackson to his knees, making his heart beat harder and more painfully than ever. "Sir, their names are Harper, Haley, and Hannah Wilson. They're triplets, 8 years old. They live in Brooklyn with their aunt. Their mother—" Thomas hesitated for a second, as if searching for the right words. But Jackson already knew that any sentence following a pause like that would hit like a blow. Their mother was Meredith Wilson. Upon hearing that name, Jackson let the whiskey glass slip from his hand. Meredith Wilson. How could he forget? The woman who had been his great love in college, the woman who made him question, if only briefly, whether the path he was choosing, international career, investments, a solitary life of excess, was truly what he wanted. They had lived an intense romance, lasting only a few months, interrupted by his decision to accept a job offer in London and end over the phone the relationship Meredith so desperately wanted to maintain. Meredith died, sir, 3 months ago. Leukemia. The sentence sounded like a verdict to Jackson. She had died and he hadn't even known. She had suffered and he wasn't there. And more. She had left 3 daughters. 3 girls who, according to the records, were born 9 years ago, exactly when they were still together. The math was cruel and precise. Those eyes that stared at him in the cemetery weren't the eyes of just any children. They were the eyes of his daughters. Breathing heavily, Jackson asked what any man would ask. Did she ever try to contact me? Thomas shook his head. No, sir. From what I could gather, Meredith chose to raise them alone. There's no record of any attempt to reach you. And so Jackson, the man who always prided himself on being in control of everything, realized he had missed the greatest opportunity of his life, being a father. For years, while he drowned in meetings and parties, while he and Eleanor silently mourned never having children, 3 little lives were growing in parallel, without him even knowing they existed. In the days that followed, Jackson ceased to be the magnate, focused solely on numbers. He became a man obsessed with understanding who Harper, Haley, and Hannah were. He hired investigators, read school reports, secretly watched ballet classes, followed their park outings from a distance. He discovered that Harper was the most determined, that Haley had an impressively analytical mind for her age, and that Hannah was a natural artist, full of sensitivity and compassion. And the more he discovered, the more guilt consumed him. Why hadn't Meredith reached out to him? Why hadn't he insisted more, stayed in touch, sought to know what became of the woman who once loved him so intensely? Until, amidst all this searching, Thomas handed him something that would change everything for good. A letter written by Meredith to her daughters, found among her belongings after her death. My girls, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there with you. Upon finishing the letter, Jackson cried as he had never cried in his entire life. And in that exact moment, he knew. The past no longer mattered, nor did what he had failed to do. What mattered was the present, and he would do everything in his power to be part of his daughters' lives. The decision Jackson made that day wasn't impulsive, though it might have seemed so to those who knew him only as the cold, calculating Wall Street investor. No, that choice was the most conscious and determined he had ever made. He would approach his daughters, not as the magnate who could buy the world, but as an ordinary man, someone willing to reclaim, inch by inch, the space he never knew he had lost. And so, days later, he arranged a meeting with Charlotte Wilson, the girl's aunt and legal guardian since Meredith's death. Charlotte was a strong, practical woman, and, as he would soon realize, fiercely protective of her nieces. The meeting took place in a small, cozy cafe in Brooklyn, chosen by her. Mr. Montgomery, I must admit, I was surprised by your contact, Charlotte said, stirring her coffee with mechanical movements, her gaze wary. Jackson, seated across from her, took a deep breath. He wasn't a man accustomed to asking for permission, let alone justifying personal decisions. But there, in front of the woman who had cared for his daughters for years, without him even knowing they existed, there was no alternative but humility. I didn't know they existed, he began, his voice trembling but sincere. I only found out after the funeral. Since then, I haven't been able to think of anything else. Charlotte studied him in silence for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Then she let out a long sigh, and for the first time since he arrived, softened her expression. Meredith never wanted to involve you. She always said you had your own life, that it would be unfair to change your path. Jackson closed his eyes for a brief moment. That sentence weighed like a verdict. He knew Meredith well enough to know she had foreseen his resistance, his stubborn dedication to business, his reluctance to accept anything that might alter his professional trajectory. She was always strong, he murmured, more to himself than to Charlotte. Yes, the aunt agreed with a small, sad smile, and that's why she faced everything alone. Jackson swallowed hard and then said, I'd like to meet them. Charlotte studied him for a few more seconds and then nodded. They know you were a friend of their mother. I told them someone important to her had come back. I thought it would be better. For now, he agreed with a nod. He knew he couldn't push too hard, nor invade the girl's world abruptly. He needed to build a bridge, brick by brick, until one day he might cross it completely. And so the following Saturday, there he was, sitting on a park bench, hands sweaty with nervousness, waiting for 3 little girls who had turned his life upside down. When he saw them approaching, He immediately recognized the pattern. Harper with her serious expression, Haley with her curious, analytical gaze, and Hannah with her more open demeanor, almost always with a shy smile. Charlotte walked just behind them, watching over them like a lioness guarding her cubs. As they approached, Jackson stood up, automatically adjusting his coat. He didn't know how to act, didn't have a script for that moment. "Hi, girls," he said with the softest voice he could muster. The three stopped, observing him with attentive, wary eyes. It was Harper who, as always, took the lead. "Are you Mommy's friend?" she asked, with that direct tone that disarmed any adult. "Yes," he replied honestly. "I was very close to her." Haley furrowed her brow, tilting her head as if analyzing a complex equation. "Why didn't you come see her when she got sick?" she asked without hesitation. Jackson felt a tightness in his chest. There was no easy answer to that question, so he chose the only possible one, the truth. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "I only found out afterward." The girls exchanged glances, as they always did, sharing that silent look only multiples understand. Then Harper turned back to him. "So why are you here now?" Jackson took a deep breath. He couldn't tell them everything, not yet, but he could give part of the answer. "Because I wanted to meet you, and because your mother was a very important person to me." Hannah smiled as if that answer was enough, and took a step closer. Harper and Haley still kept their distance, but not as much as before, and so, without realizing it, Jackson Montgomery began to break through the first layer of ice. That afternoon, they spent hours walking through the park. Jackson listened to them talk about school, ballet classes, how much they loved going to the ice cream shop after school. He didn't reveal who he really was, but he absorbed every piece of information, every gesture, every look, like someone collecting small treasures. In the following meetings, this ritual continued. Trips to the zoo, visits to the Natural History Museum, afternoons at the neighborhood bookstore. Little by little, the girls began to open up more, to trust him, to allow him to become part of the small universe they had built after losing their mother. Until one day, while walking together in Prospect Park, Hannah, the most sensitive of the three, spontaneously held his hand. "Are you going to keep coming?" she asked, with that look that mixed hope and fear. Jackson gently squeezed her hand and replied without hesitation, "As long as you want me to." That night, lying in his penthouse staring at the ceiling, Jackson realized he didn't want to be just an occasional presence in his daughters' lives. He wanted to be a father, truly. He wanted to be there to help with homework, to attend ballet recitals, to take them to the doctor, to scold when necessary, to hug when needed. But how could he do that without destroying the delicate structure they had built with Charlotte? How could he cross that bridge without breaking it? That's when he decided to take a more concrete step. He began looking for a new apartment, a place that could be a true home for them, a space with enough bedrooms, areas for studying, playing, dancing. It wouldn't be just a whim or another investment. It would be a silent declaration, an invitation. And while architects sent the first sketches, Jackson also began preparing another important part of this transformation, himself. He started attending sessions with a child therapist, read books on raising multiples, studied the psychological development of triplets. He didn't just want to be ready to say, "I'm your father." He wanted to be ready to truly be one. In parallel, the girls also began showing signs that their relationship was deepening. Hannah started sending him small drawings. Haley borrowed books from him. Harper, the most resistant, finally laughed at one of his jokes. And then one day, Charlotte called him for a talk. "They know you're someone special. They feel it," she said, looking him in the eyes. "But you need to decide if you're going to tell them everything." Jackson felt the weight of that responsibility. He knew that moment would come. He just didn't expect it to be so soon. Charlotte added, "They're strong, like their mother." Jackson smiled, remembering Meredith, and replied, "I know, and for them I need to be strong too." The days following that conversation with Charlotte were filled with intense reflection for Jackson. He knew the truth couldn't be hidden forever, but he also feared the impact that revelation might have on the girls. Would it be selfish to fully step into their lives, claiming the title of father, when they had built such a stable routine with their aunt? Or would it be a legitimate opportunity to make up, even partially, for the years of absence? While he pondered, the girls, without realizing it, continued to break down the walls he had built throughout his life. On a cold autumn afternoon during a museum visit, Haley, with her always keen eye for detail, noticed a Renaissance painting, and pointing to one of the figures casually said, "He stands the same way you do." Jackson laughed, surprised by the observation, but inside he felt his heart tighten. It was as if intuitively they were starting to sense the invisible connections binding them. The same happened days later when Harper, after lunch at a small neighborhood pizzeria, commented, "You like pepperoni pizza, like us." These small, almost offhand remarks were weaving a silent web of connection, but nothing touched him as much as the day Hannah, during an afternoon of park playtime, approached him out of the blue and asked, "Have you ever loved someone for real?" Jackson didn't know what to say for a few seconds. The question, coming from a child, had the force of a blow. "I have," he finally answered, his voice breaking. "I loved very much." "And did she love you too?" Hannah pressed, with that purity only children possess. "Yes," he replied without hesitation, looking at the horizon and imagining Meredith's smile. "She loved me too." Hannah simply nodded, as if she already knew the answer, and ran back to her sisters. Jackson stood there, hands in his coat pockets, feeling that the moment of revelation was drawing closer. The following week, Charlotte invited him for dinner at their house. Jackson sensed something was different the moment he arrived. The girls greeted him with unusual enthusiasm, especially Harper, always more reserved, who welcomed him with a shy but genuine smile. During dinner, Charlotte made a point of stepping back a bit, letting them feel more at ease. Amid laughter and school stories, Haley, with her characteristic scientific curiosity, asked, "Did you know we're working on a family tree project at school?" Jackson raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Really?" "Yes," Hannah confirmed excitedly. "And we want to know more about Mommy and who she knew." Jackson swallowed hard. Charlotte, watching discreetly from the kitchen, gave him a supportive look. "I can help with whatever you want," he said sincerely. "You knew Mommy really well, didn't you?" Harper asked, looking straight at him. "Yes, very well," he replied, meeting her gaze and struggling to keep his emotions in check. "So, can you tell us things?" Hannah asked. Jackson smiled, taking one of Hannah's small hands in his. "Of course I can. What do you want to know?" And so they spent the evening, him recounting stories from college, the trips he took with Meredith, the things she loved, especially her passion for literature and flowers. The girls listened, enchanted, laughing when he told of Meredith's cooking mishaps or the times she got lost on campus. When he said goodbye that night, Harper walked him to the door. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" she asked, with the seriousness that was her trademark. "If you want me to, yes," he replied. "I want you to," she said, before closing the door. And there, in the hallway of that simple Brooklyn building, Jackson knew the toughest wall had already been partially broken down. The next day he arrived early, bringing an old photo album. Charlotte greeted him and, smiling, said, "I think they're ready." "For what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "To know who you are." Jackson took a deep breath and walked in. The girls were in the living room organizing papers for their family tree project. When they saw him, they ran to hug him, even Harper. "I brought something for you," he said, showing the album. "Photos?" Hannah asked, already excited. "Yes. Some photos of me with your mum from when we were younger." The three gathered around, sitting on the rug, as Jackson knelt to show them the pictures. "This was the first time we traveled together," he said, pointing to a photo where he and Meredith appeared smiling, arms around each other in front of a mountain cabin. "You look happy," Haley commented, always attentive to details. "I was," he replied, smiling. As they flipped through the pages, the girls asked questions, wanting to know about the clothes, the places, the stories behind each image. Until at one point, Harper, with her characteristic bluntness, asked, "Did you love Mommy?" Jackson slowly closed the album, took a deep breath and looked at the three of them. "Yes," he answered without hesitation. "Very much." The three fell silent, exchanging glances as they always did. And then it was Hannah who asked, "Why didn't you ever come before?" Jackson felt the lump in his throat tighten, but he knew he had to be honest. "Because I didn't know you existed." The girls looked at each other again, but this time the look was different. It wasn't distrust, but understanding. Harper furrowed her brow as if organizing her thoughts, and then asked, "Are you our dad?" The world seemed to stop in that moment. Jackson felt his heart pound so hard, he thought it might leap out of his chest. "Yes," he finally answered, "I am." The girls remained still for a few seconds, processing the information, until Hannah stood up, walked over to him, and hugged him tightly. "I knew it," she whispered. Haley soon approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You have the same eyes as us." And Harper, always the most resistant, stood there for a few more seconds before finally approaching and saying seriously, "You took your time." "I know," he replied, his eyes welling up. "Please forgive me." The three hugged him, and in that moment there were no more barriers, secrets, or guilt that could resist. It was just a father and his daughters, reunited, even if belatedly, by the strongest bond there is, love. After that day, the dynamic between them changed completely. Jackson began participating even more actively in the girls' routine. He picked them up and dropped them off at school, attended ballet recitals, helped with homework, and in parallel, the renovations on the new apartment progressed rapidly. Each of the girls had chosen how they wanted their rooms. Harper opted for a classic decor, with a bookshelf and a reading nook. Haley chose a modern setup with space for scientific experiments, and Hannah, of course, requested an art studio with an easel and an entire wall for her paintings. When the apartment was finished, Jackson invited the three to see it. "Wow," Hannah exclaimed, running into her room. "This place is amazing," Haley said, analyzing the furniture layout. Harper, more reserved, walked slowly to the bookshelf filled with books, ran her fingers along the spines, and with a half-smile said, "You remembered." "I remember everything you tell me," Jackson replied, moved. And that night, as the three ran from room to room exploring every corner of the new home, Jackson realized he was finally living what he had always told Eleanor he regretted not having, the experience of being a father. But at the same time, he knew that despite all the progress, there was still one final step to take, something missing to fully solidify that bond. That final step, Jackson knew, was to formalize his presence in the girls' lives, not just as a frequent visitor or their mother's friend, but as what he truly was, their father. Though the revelation had already happened on an emotional level, it was still necessary to establish it legally, to consolidate the bond with all its rights and responsibilities, ensuring that if anything ever happened to Charlotte, the girls would not be left unprotected. But it wasn't just a bureaucratic matter. It was, above all, a gesture of love and responsibility. So, on a cold winter morning, Jackson sought out Charlotte to discuss the matter. "I want to officially adopt the girls," he said firmly, as they sipped coffee in the cozy kitchen of her Brooklyn apartment. Charlotte looked at him for a few seconds in silence, assessing not just the proposal, but the man before her. For months, she had observed how he dedicated himself to her nieces with a care that went beyond mere remorse or financial compensation. Jackson was truly present, at doctor's appointments, school meetings, ballet recitals. He was already part of the girls' routine, and more importantly, part of their hearts. "Are you sure?" she asked, knowing it was a step with no turning back. "I am," he replied without hesitation. "I want them to have security, stability, and I want them to know they can always count on me." Charlotte smiled, moved. "They already know that, but yes, I think it would be important, for them and for you." And so, with Charlotte's support, Jackson began the legal adoption process. He consulted specialized lawyers, gathered the necessary documentation, and started preparing the girls for the news. It was on a Saturday afternoon, while sipping hot chocolate after a morning of ice skating, that Jackson decided to bring up the subject. "Girls," he began as they settled around the table, still laughing about their falls on the rink, "I want to talk to you about something important." The three fell silent immediately, looking at him with those attentive eyes ready to absorb every word. "I know our relationship started differently, and that, for many years, I wasn't present in your lives as I should have been." Harper, always direct, interrupted, "But now you are." Jackson smiled, touched by the simplicity of the statement. "Yes, now I am, and I want to be always. So I was wondering, what would you think if I officially adopted you, if I became truly on paper and in every way your father?" The three exchanged glances, in one of those silent conversations only they could have. Then Harper spoke, with the authority of the trio's usual spokesperson. "You already are." Jackson felt his eyes well up. "But we want you to pick us up from school, even if you're busy," Haley added, with her logical reasoning. "And come watch us dance always," Hannah completed with that sweet smile. "I promise," Jackson replied, holding their hands. "Always." And so, the process moved forward smoothly. Charlotte signed the necessary documents, the lawyers handled every detail, and in a few weeks the adoption was finalized. On the day the judge gave the final approval, Jackson took the girls to celebrate at a special dinner. They chose a rustic pizzeria with a wood-fired oven and a cozy atmosphere. During dinner, Jackson raised a glass of soda with them. "To our family," he said, lifting his glass. "To the Montgomery girls." Hannah cheered, laughing. And so, amid slices of pizza and laughter, they sealed the new chapter of their story. But the true celebration came a few days later, when Jackson, in a symbolic and heartfelt gesture, gave each of them a special gift. He took them to his new home, the apartment they had helped decorate, and led them to the studio, where 3 carefully wrapped boxes awaited, each with one of their names. "This is for you," he said, watching their surprised and curious expressions. Harper opened hers first, a necklace with a delicate book-shaped pendant inscribed with the word strength. Haley unwrapped hers, a microscope-shaped pendant with the word wisdom. And Hannah, upon opening hers, found a small silver paintbrush with the word sensitivity. The 3 looked at him, moved. "They're beautiful," Hannah exclaimed. "I wanted to give you something that represents what each of you means, and what your mother always saw in you," Jackson explained, recalling Meredith's letter and the words she had used to describe them. "She used to call us that," Harper said, with an emotional smile. "And I always will too," Jackson added, hugging all 3 at once. From that day on, visits became even more frequent, until they became an integral part of the girls' routine. Jackson picked them up and dropped them off at school, attended doctor's visits, watched every ballet recital, and became a constant presence at school meetings. And it was at one of those meetings, a few months later, that he had one of the most memorable moments of his new life as a father. He had been invited by Haley's teacher to participate in a science fair, where students presented projects developed over the semester. Haley, of course, prepared an experiment on light refraction. On the day of the presentation, Jackson arrived early with a proud smile on his face and saw Haley carefully adjusting the materials on her table. When she saw him, she ran to him and hugged him, not caring about her classmates around. "You came," she said, with that sparkle in her eyes. "Of course I came. I wouldn't miss this for anything." And there, as he listened to his daughter enthusiastically explain her experiment to visitors, Jackson realized once again that he had made the right choice. She wasn't just the smart girl he had observed from afar in the early days. She was his daughter, his pride, his joy. The same happened weeks later, during a ballet recital, when he watched Hannah perform a solo with such grace and expressiveness that it drew applause from the entire audience. And soon after, Harper won a school writing contest with an essay about family, in which she wrote about a man who arrived suddenly but who had always been there in the heart. Jackson read that essay, sent by the teacher, with tears in his eyes. More than any official document, those words sealed definitively the place he now occupied in their lives. And alongside all this, life continued in the small details that only parents understand. Taking them to the doctor when they caught colds, preparing snacks for school trips, waking up early for ballet rehearsals, helping with homework, listening to endless confidences and stories. Each of these experiences was, for Jackson, an invaluable gift. And it was on one of those ordinary mornings, while preparing coffee in the apartment's kitchen, that Harper approached and casually asked, "Dad, can you help me with a literature assignment?" The word echoed in Jackson's ears like music. "Of course, sweetheart," he replied, smiling. And so, between a cup of coffee and pages of books, he realized he was finally where he always should have been. The months passed, and the bond between Jackson and the girls grew ever stronger, more organic, more complete. There was no longer that initial awkwardness, that need to prove himself or seek approval with every gesture. Now they were simply a family, with all the joys and challenges that come with it. Jackson's new apartment had truly become a home. Each of the girls' rooms reflected not only their tastes and personalities, but also the story they had built together. Harper, with her reading nook filled with classics, spent hours curled up in an armchair reading and sometimes discussing literature with her father. Haley turned her room into a veritable laboratory, where she conducted small scientific experiments and often enlisted Jackson to help test hypotheses. Hannah, with her paints and brushes always at hand, filled her space's walls with colorful paintings that expressed her emotions and worldview. Weekends were always filled with family activities. They went to the theater, the zoo, museums. They had picnics in Central Park and sometimes just spent the afternoon playing board games or cooking together. Jackson discovered, to his surprise, that he had a hidden talent for making pancakes in creative shapes, something the girls loved and always requested on Sunday mornings. But even with all this harmony, there was one tradition that remained the most important for everyone: visiting Meredith's grave, which they did religiously on every significant date. Her birthday, Mother's Day, or simply when they missed her. It was during one of these visits that one of the most memorable moments occurred. The four of them stood before the tombstone, carefully adorned with white flowers, the kind Meredith loved. The wind blew gently and the sky was clear, as if nature itself wanted to pay tribute. As always, the girls brought small symbolic gifts. Harper brought a book, Haley a flower she had grown, and Hannah a drawing depicting the family, with 4 figures holding hands. Jackson remained silent, respecting each girl's moment. Then, when they had all paid their tributes, he approached the tombstone, knelt, and, with a trembling voice, said, "Meredith, I know I took my time, but I'm here, and I promise I'll never fail again." The girls approached and hugged him in silence. No words were needed. That gesture was enough. On the way back home in the car, Harper broke the silence. "Dad, do you think Mommy is watching us?" Jackson looked in the rearview mirror, seeing the 3 in the back seat, and answered with the purest certainty he held within. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm sure she is." And the 3 smiled, comforted by that response. From that day on, they began a small ritual whenever they gathered. They lit a candle, looked at a photo of Meredith, and shared a happy memory about her. Jackson always participated, listening attentively to each story, and when asked, shared his own memories, always highlighting the qualities he so admired: her intelligence, strength, sensitivity. During one of these rituals, as Hannah talked about how much she loved hearing her mother sing before bed, Jackson had an idea that he quickly shared with the girls. "What if we made an album about Mommy, with all the stories, photos, and memories we have of her?" The 3 loved the idea, and in the following weeks they dedicated themselves enthusiastically to the project. They gathered old photos, pasted notes and drawings, and wrote short texts. Jackson helped organize and lay out the content, and in the end had a beautiful leather-bound album made titled "Forever, Mommy." When the album was finished, they held a small ceremony at home, with Charlotte present. Each read a passage, and in the end, they all hugged, crying and smiling at the same time. It was, without a doubt, one of the most precious legacies they could build together. As this new life flourished, Jackson began to notice significant changes in himself. The man who once lived for business, investments, and accumulating wealth now understood the true value of things. He discovered that the most important moments weren't measured in figures, but in laughter at the table, unexpected hugs, small gestures of affection. One day, while walking with Harper through her favorite bookstore, she stopped by a shelf, picked up a book, and asked, "Dad, why did you always work so much before?" Jackson thought for a few seconds and answered honestly, "Because I thought that was what mattered, that it was how I'd be happy. And now," she pressed, with that inquisitive look, "now I know what matters most is being with you." Harper smiled, satisfied with the answer, and went back to browsing the book. These small moments were, for Jackson, confirmation that he had found his true purpose. The money, the companies, the investments, all of that was still there, but now it was secondary. His priority was different: being a father, being present, building a solid and loving relationship with his daughters. This transformation didn't go unnoticed by Charlotte, who, one night while they sipped tea after the girls went to bed, commented, "You've changed a lot, Jackson." He smiled, looking at the steaming cups on the table. "Actually, I think I'm becoming who I should have been from the start." Charlotte nodded, silently agreeing. And indeed, the change was visible to everyone. Friends and colleagues noticed how Jackson was lighter, more serene. The press, always attentive to the moves of billionaires, speculated about his supposed retirement, as he began delegating many of his company's functions to trusted executives, freeing up his schedule for what, to him, was now non-negotiable: family. But there was one moment, in particular, that Jackson still held as a dream to be fulfilled: taking a trip with the girls, just the 4 of them, to create new memories, away from routine and daily obligations. And it was during a casual dinner one night that he decided to propose the idea. "Girls, what would you think of taking a trip during the holidays?" The 3 widened their eyes, excited. "Where to?" Hannah asked, practically bouncing in her chair. "Well, I was thinking we could go to Scotland." They exchanged curious glances. Why? Harper asked. Because that's where your mother discovered how much she loved Scottish literature, and she always told me she wanted to take you there one day, to see the landscapes, the castles, the culture. The three fell silent for a few seconds, absorbing the idea until Haley, always practical, asked, "When are we going?" Jackson laughed. "Next holidays, I promise." And so they began planning the trip together, choosing the places they wanted to visit. Loch Ness, Edinburgh, ancient castles, small villages. Each made a list, and Jackson, of course, promised they'd try to fulfill all their requests. The anticipation for the trip brought even more excitement to the family's routine, which now had another adventure on the horizon. But above all, it served to solidify once and for all the sense of belonging they all already shared, even if they didn't always express it. And for Jackson, that was the greatest of all victories. The day of the trip finally arrived. Jackson couldn't have been more excited or nervous. Though accustomed to international business trips, with meticulously planned itineraries executed with almost military precision, this trip had an entirely different meaning. It wasn't about closing deals or attending conferences, but about giving his daughters an unforgettable experience, a dive into their roots, and above all, quality time together, away from daily pressures. The airport departure was a celebration. Hannah, with her endless curiosity, wanted to know everything about the plane, while Haley explained to her sisters the aerodynamic workings of wings and engines. Harper, as always, maintained a more serious demeanor, but Jackson could see in the sparkle of her eyes the same excitement vibrating in every gesture of her sisters. When they landed in Edinburgh, they were greeted by a cloudy sky, typical of the Scottish lands, and that damp cold Jackson remembered so well from his trips with Meredith. He felt a pang in his chest, realizing that if life had taken a different course, perhaps it would be her there, holding the girls' hands, showing them every street, every castle, every piece of history she so loved. But he quickly pushed that thought away. Now the mission was his. In the first few days they explored the city with enthusiasm. They visited Edinburgh Castle, where the girls were fascinated by stories of kings and queens, ghosts, and medieval battles. Hannah sketched the ancient costumes. Harper jotted down curiosities in a small notebook, and Haley, of course, asked everything about the architecture and defense systems. Then they headed to the Highlands, traveling along winding roads surrounded by green mountains and dark-watered lochs. It was during one of these stops, by the shores of Loch Ness, that Jackson had one of the most important conversations with his daughters. They were sitting by the water's edge, watching the calm surface, when Harper suddenly asked, "Dad, do you think Mummy would have liked seeing this with us?" Jackson took a deep breath, looking at the misty horizon, and answered honestly, "Yes, sweetheart, she would have loved it." "And do you think she's watching?" Harper pressed, always seeking concrete answers for her emotions. "I think so," Jackson replied, holding her hand. "In some way, I think she's always with us." Hannah came closer, hugging him from behind, and Haley, with her analytical gaze, added, "Even if we can't see her, she's there, because she's in us." Jackson smiled, moved by the maturity of her words. Exactly. After that moment, they continued their journey to the islands, exploring breathtaking landscapes, quaint villages, and ruined castles. Each day was a new discovery, a new memory built, another piece in the emotional puzzle they had been assembling together since that first silent encounter in the cemetery. One night, staying in a cozy inn, they sat around the fireplace, sipping hot chocolate. It was Harper who once again sparked a meaningful conversation. "Dad, we never asked this, but were you mad at Mommy for not telling you about us?" Jackson looked at the three, sitting there with their attentive eyes and open hearts, and answered with the utmost honesty he could muster. "No, my girls, I was never mad. I was sad, very sad, for not having had the chance to see you grow from babies, for missing so many moments. But I can't blame Mommy. She did what she thought was best at the time, and I respect that." The girls nodded silently, understanding more than they might have been able to express in words. "And now?" Hannah asked, curious. Now I just want to cherish every moment with you, every single one." And so they did. The trip continued, light, full of laughter, walks, photos, small adventures that only those traveling as a family understand. When, after 2 weeks, they returned to New York, they carried suitcases full of memories and hearts full of stories. Back in their routine, life went on, but Jackson noticed something subtle had changed. The girls were more connected to him than ever. There was no longer that shadow of the past, that hesitation. Now they were simply father and daughters, living together, making plans, sharing dreams. And one of those dreams came up on a rainy spring afternoon when Hannah, with her contagious enthusiasm, said, "Dad, we could write a book." Jackson, who was reading quietly on the couch, smiled. "A book? About what?" "About our story," she replied, excited. "About how we found each other." Haley, listening from the armchair, agreed. "It would be interesting. And we could include photos, too, like we did with Mommy's album." Harper, always more reserved, pondered. "But who would want to read it?" Jackson smiled, pulling Harper to sit beside him. "Maybe no one, or maybe a lot of people. The important thing isn't who will read it, but that we record it, so we never forget." And so they began working on the project little by little, gathering texts, photos, memories, Hannah's drawings, Haley's reflections, and poems written by Harper. The book became more than a record. It was a celebration of their journey. While working on it, their family routine remained full of commitments. Classes, recitals, science fairs. Jackson was so integrated into the girls' school life that when Harper's teacher organized a poetry reading, she invited him to recite with her. "But me?" he asked, surprised. "Yes," Harper insisted, with that half smile he had learned to decipher. "You like poetry, and Mommy liked it too." And so that afternoon, in front of an audience of parents and students, Jackson took the stage alongside his daughter to recite an Emily Dickinson poem chosen by Harper. As he read the verses with Harper by his side, he felt immense pride, a fulfillment no professional achievement could ever match. Later, as they walked home together, Harper held his hand, something that months earlier would have been unthinkable. "You did well," she said, with her usual reserved manner. "You too, sweetheart, very well." And in that moment, Jackson realized it didn't matter how much time they had lost. What mattered was what they were building now, and that love, when true, could fill any gap, heal any absence. Charlotte, who followed everything from a distance, couldn't hide her joy at seeing how their relationship had evolved. One night, as the four dined together, she commented, "If Meredith could see all this." Jackson squeezed her hand and finished, "I think she does." And Charlotte nodded, moved without needing to say more. The following months were full of life, of small and big victories. Haley won a medal at the science fair. Hannah had a painting selected for a children's art exhibition. Harper published a poem in the school magazine. And with every victory, Jackson was there, cheering, celebrating, participating in every step. Until one night, as they finished the book they had written together, Harper asked, "Dad, if none of this had happened, if you hadn't seen us at the cemetery, do you think we would have found each other?" Jackson thought for a few seconds, looking at the three, and answered with a voice full of emotion, "I think fate always finds a way." The girls smiled, hugging him, and in that embrace was the greatest certainty of all. They were indeed a family. Not because biology or the law said so, but because love had decided it. The book was completed in early summer. Hardcover, simple and direct title, Our Story. Each chapter narrated a part of the path they had walked together, from that first silent encounter in the cemetery, through the outings, the important conversations, the mutual discoveries, and of course, the trip to Scotland that had meant so much to them all. As he flipped through the freshly printed copy, Jackson couldn't hold back tears. In those pages was much more than a collection of texts and images. It was the testimony of a love born from the unexpected, of bonds rebuilt, of opportunities seized with courage. The girls were thrilled to receive their copies. Hannah ran to her room and soon returned with a bookmark she had made herself, featuring drawings of all four of them side by side. Haley, of course, analyzed every graphic detail of the printing, and Harper, silently, hugged the book to her chest, with that look that said everything without needing words. To celebrate the project's completion, Jackson suggested a picnic in Central Park. It was one of those perfect days, with a bright blue sky and a gentle breeze. They prepared the basket together with sandwiches, fruits, and juices. Charlotte joined them, as she always did, but this time more as a guest than a guardian. As the girls ran after a frisbee Jackson had bought, he and Charlotte settled on the blanket, watching the scene. "They seem so happy," Charlotte commented, smiling. "And they are," Jackson replied, not taking his eyes off his daughters. Charlotte was silent for a moment, then added, "Meredith would be proud." Jackson nodded, his eyes welling up. Sometimes I wonder, what if I had made different choices? What if I had stayed, built all this with her from the beginning? Charlotte placed a hand on his, with a compassionate gesture. You're here now, and that's what matters. Jackson took a deep breath and agreed. Yes, and I'll never stop being here. When the girls returned, exhausted and laughing, they sat around the blanket, devouring the sandwiches. Dad, Haley began, her voice full of anticipation. We were thinking... Jackson raised his eyebrows, curious. Yes? We could start a book club, here at home, with you. Hannah quickly added, each week one of us picks a book and we read it together. And Harper, after a brief silence, confirmed, it would be cool. Jackson smiled, moved by the proposal. I love the idea. And who picks the first book? The three exchanged glances, and after a brief silent vote with their eyes, Harper spoke up. You, he laughed. Me? That's a big responsibility. And so, the following week, they started the family book club, beginning with The Little Prince, a classic that spoke of essential things invisible to the eyes, exactly like many of the things they had experienced so far. Family reading nights became a tradition. They sat in the living room, each with their copy, pausing to discuss passages, reflect on lessons, and of course, laugh at Hannah's creative interpretations or Haley's technical analyses. During one of these sessions, Harper, always more reserved, made a comment that caught everyone by surprise. I think sometimes you have to get lost to find yourself. Everyone looked at her, impressed by the depth of the statement. Jackson leaned over and hugged her tightly. You're absolutely right, sweetheart. And that phrase stuck, becoming something they repeated whenever doubts or difficulties arose. Meanwhile, the book they had written began circulating among family and friends. Charlotte, proud, showed it to colleagues at work. And soon other parents started commenting on the story, moved by the journey of that family formed so improbably and so beautifully. One day, Hannah's teacher asked permission to take the book to school and share it with students as inspiration for an activity on families that reinvent themselves. Jackson was surprised but delighted. Of course, go ahead. And so, their story began touching other lives, showing that there isn't just one model of family, that bonds can be built at any time, as long as there is love, respect, and dedication. One weekend, they decided to do something different, a camping trip outside the city. They chose a state park, rented a cabin, and spent 2 days surrounded by nature, hiking, fishing, telling stories around the campfire. On one of those nights, as they roasted marshmallows, Harper asked, Dad, are you afraid of anything? Jackson thought for a few seconds and then answered, Yes, I am. The three widened their eyes, surprised. Of what? Haley asked. Of not cherishing every second with you. Of missing any important moment. Hannah came closer and hugged him. But you're always with us. Jackson smiled, stroking her hair. And I always will be. After that night, they started making lists of things we want to do together, jotting them down in a special notebook. Some were simple, like bake a cake together. Others more ambitious, like visit all the museums in New York. And of course, they promised to do each one. Jackson had never felt so happy, so complete. With every laugh from his daughters, every tight hug, every new discovery, he realized his life had finally found a purpose no amount of money could provide. And as they continued checking off items from the list, going on new adventures, time passed. Not as a relentless enemy racing by, but as a generous ally, allowing them to build a rich, meaningful story. One day, as they returned from another museum visit, Harper, from the back seat of the car, asked, Dad, do you think we've changed? Jackson looked in the rearview mirror and smiled. I think so. We've all changed. Haley added, for the better. And Hannah, hugging the notebook of lists, concluded, because now we're a family. And Jackson, with his heart overflowing, replied, yes, now we are. The notebook of lists had become almost a symbol of the new life Jackson and the girls shared. Each filled page was a silent victory, a celebration of a moment lived together, a memory immortalized. And as they checked off one item after another, the bond between them grew even stronger, more solid, more true. Among the activities already completed were bike rides along the Hudson River Park, entire afternoons cooking recipes suggested by Hannah, visits to rare libraries recommended by Harper, and even a stargazing night, organized with all of Haley's scientific rigor, complete with charts and spreadsheets to track the movements of the stars. But there was one item on the list they hadn't yet done, one the three mentioned often: taking a trip to a place they had never been. Just the four of them, with no one else, no commitments or obligations. "Dad, we could go to California," Hannah suggested one night as they dined together. "Or to Iceland to see the northern lights," Haley added, always fascinated by natural phenomena. "Or just spend a weekend at a farm with horses," Harper said, surprising Jackson, who didn't know about her love for horses. He laughed and promised, "We'll do all of those things, one at a time." And so, they chose to start with the farm trip, closer and simpler, but promising to be just as special. The following weekend, Jackson rented a country house 2 hours from the city. The place had everything they had asked for: horses, a pond for swimming, fruit trees, and a garden they could explore. Upon arrival, the girls were enchanted. Hannah ran to an apple tree and started picking fruit. Haley was fascinated by the garden and began asking the caretaker about cultivation methods, while Harper quietly approached a white horse, stroking it gently. Jackson watched each scene with a mix of pride and gratitude. Seeing his daughters happy, at ease in that environment, free, was one of the greatest rewards of his life. They spent the days riding horses, hiking, picking vegetables and fruits for meals, playing cards at night by the fireplace, and telling stories until late. On one of those nights, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Harper asked, "Dad, do you think one day you'll forget us?" Jackson widened his eyes, surprised by the question. "Forget you? Never, sweetheart. Not even if I lived 1,000 years." She smiled, satisfied with the answer, and turned back to the sky. Hannah then came closer and asked, "What if we grow up and move far away?" Jackson laughed, hugging her. "Even then, you'll always be my daughters, and I'll always be with you wherever you are." Haley, with her pragmatic manner, commented, "Statistically, people move cities about 4 or 5 times in their lives." Jackson laughed, kissing her forehead. "And every time you move, I'll help with the move visit. And if you let me, even take you out to dinner." The girls smiled, hugging him. On the way back from the trip, as he drove and the three slept in the back seat, exhausted, Jackson reflected on everything they had lived through since the day of Eleanor's funeral, when, unknowingly, he first saw those 3 small figures hiding behind a tree. How life had changed since then. From the man who lived alone in a Manhattan penthouse, surrounded by luxury and emptiness, he had become the father of 3 extraordinary girls who filled his life with meaning, color, and emotion. And as he drove, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw the 3 sleeping, nestled together, with that peaceful expression of those who know they are loved and protected. And he smiled, his heart overflowing with gratitude. In the following months, they continued checking off items from the list. They learned to surf together during a trip to California, visited an observatory to fulfill Haley's dream of seeing Saturn through a powerful telescope, participated in an art workshop where Hannah painted an entire mural, and even took a French cooking class to satisfy Harper's unexpected desire to learn how to make croissants. Each of these experiences generated new stories, new inside jokes, new traditions. And so the notebook of lists, which had started as an unpretentious idea, became a true diary of family adventures, a time capsule that Jackson knew one day they would flip through, fondly recalling each moment lived together. One day, while organizing photos from one of these trips, Hannah asked, "Dad, do you still miss your old life?" Jackson thought for a few seconds, looking at the images on the computer screen, the girls smiling on the beach, setting up tents, running through fields. And he answered with complete sincerity, "No, I don't miss it, because now I have you." And the 3 smiled, knowing without a shadow of doubt that it was true. One afternoon, as they strolled through Central Park, they passed by the oak tree where, months earlier, Jackson had seen them for the first time. They stopped there instinctively and stood looking at the tree in silence for a few moments. "It was here," Harper said simply. Jackson nodded. "It was." Haley, with her ever-curious gaze to understand the world, asked, "Did you know that day that we were your daughters?" Jackson took a deep breath, recalling the strange, profound feeling he had when he saw those 3 girls standing there, as if fate were calling him. "I didn't know, but I felt something strong, like life was showing me what I could no longer ignore." The girls remained silent, absorbing that response. Then Hannah came closer, took his hand and said, "I'm glad you didn't ignore it." And in that childlike simplicity was the deepest of truths. Yes, Thank goodness he didn't ignore it. Thank goodness he had the courage to follow that intuition, to seek, to approach, to take on a role he might not have been ready for in the past. And now there, holding hands with his daughters under the shade of that oak tree that marked the starting point of everything, Jackson had the most absolute certainty of his life. This was his story, his mission, his greatest legacy. It wouldn't be the successful investments, the buildings erected, or the contracts signed that would define his existence, but those 3 lives now walking beside him with firm steps and open hearts. As they walked back home talking about the next items on the list they wanted to check off, Jackson felt fuller than he ever had, and deep down, he knew they still had many pages to write together in this story that, for him, would never end. Days piled up like autumn leaves, slowly creating a new landscape, different from the one Jackson knew when his life was an endless cycle of meetings, mergers, and investments. Now the landscape was made of shared breakfasts, supervised homework, watched ballet rehearsals, and quiet nights when he read bedtime stories aloud before turning off his daughter's bedroom lights. The list of things to do together kept growing, and it was no longer a formal notebook. It was almost a spontaneous habit, a family philosophy. When someone had a new idea, they'd just say, "Shall we add it to the list?" And everyone understood that soon it would become another lived memory. On one of those days, Haley came up with an unexpected proposal. "Dad, we could plant a tree." Jackson raised his eyebrows, surprised and curious. "A tree?" "Yes," she replied, excited. "Our family tree. So it grows with us." Harper and Hannah, overhearing, got excited too. "It could be in the park," Hannah suggested. "Or in our backyard," Harper added practically. And Jackson, as always, embraced the idea with enthusiasm. That weekend, they went together to a specialized nursery and chose a cherry tree sapling. After a long vote where Hannah wanted a willow, Harper advocated for an oak, and Haley, of course, wanted a sequoia, until Jackson explained there wasn't enough space for such a large tree in the apartment's garden. Planting the cherry tree became an event. They dug the hole together, carefully placed the sapling, and each added a bit of soil, sealing their collective commitment. "Now it will grow with us," Haley said, satisfied. "And when it blooms, it'll be our reminder of everything we've lived," Harper added. Jackson, looking at the small tree, felt deeply moved. It was a discreet but powerful symbol of what they had built. Months later, when spring arrived and the first flowers appeared on the cherry tree's fragile branches, Jackson took the girls to the garden to see. "Look!" Hannah exclaimed, pointing to the pink petals. "It's alive!" Haley celebrated. And Harper, with that smile she only showed when truly happy, said, "It's growing like us." And Jackson hugged them, moved, feeling that scene was etched not only in the photos they took, but above all, in the emotional memory they shared. Another memorable moment came when the school organized an event called Family Day, where students could introduce their families to classmates and teachers and talk about their story. Harper, Haley, and Hannah insisted Jackson attend, and he, of course, accepted with pride. On the day of the event, he arrived at the school with the 3, wearing a sweater the girls had chosen, according to them, to look less serious and more like a dad. During the presentation, each child took the stage and spoke a few words. When it was the triplets' turn, Harper took the microphone first. "This is our dad, Jackson Montgomery." Haley quickly added, "He likes reading with us, traveling, and making funny-shaped pancakes." And Hannah, closing the presentation with her usual spontaneity, said, "And he loves us." The audience applauded, and Jackson, with tears in his eyes, took the stage and hugged the 3 under Charlotte's proud gaze from the audience. After the event, as they walked back home, Harper asked, "Dad, do you remember when we didn't know you were our dad?" Jackson nodded, clearly recalling that time so recent, yet so distant. "I do. I think, deep down, we always knew," she commented thoughtfully. Jackson smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "Maybe, sometimes the heart knows before the mind." And once again they realized that, even without sharing the first years of life together, they had been united by an invisible, unbreakable bond. As months turned into years, new stages emerged. The girls were growing, changing, maturing. Harper, always so serious, began to take an interest in classic literature and talked about becoming a writer. Haley, with her passion for science, joined the school's robotics club, and Hannah continued developing her artistic talents, with paintings displayed even at local fairs. Jackson followed everything, participated in every achievement, celebrated every victory, always present, always by their side. And one night, as they dined together, Hannah asked, "Dad, do you still remember Mommy?" Jackson smiled, looking at each of them and answering with tenderness, "Every single day." Harper then added, "Me too." And Haley concluded, "I think when we remember, she never really goes away." Jackson nodded, moved, realizing that even in her absence, Meredith remained a constant, loving presence in all their lives. And as a silent tribute, every year on Meredith's birthday they kept the tradition. They went to the grave, brought flowers, read poems, and stood together in silence, honoring the woman who, though gone too soon, had left the most precious legacy of all, the three incredible girls who were now the center of Jackson's life. On one of those birthdays, as they prepared to leave the house, Harper asked, "Dad, do you think Mommy knew you'd come?" Jackson looked at her, surprised by the depth of the question, and answered, "I think, somehow, she always knew." And that day, as they stood before the tombstone, placing the flowers with the same care as always, Jackson felt, once again, that quiet, powerful certainty, that despite all the missed chances, all the absences, all the unspoken words, life, with its silent wisdom, had found a way to bring them together, to heal the wounds, to transform loss into love, and longing into presence. And as they walked back hand in hand, the four silhouettes merging under the soft light of the sunset, Jackson knew, without a shadow of doubt, that this was his greatest achievement, his true legacy, his most important story. Time, as always, continued its silent, inevitable course. The girls grew, their tastes changed, conversations deepened, challenges evolved, but what remained unchanging was the bond they had built, solid, unbreakable, rooted in every experience they shared, every choice made, every hug exchanged. One night, as they dined together as they always did on Fridays, Hannah, now almost 12, commented, "Dad, did you know you were the best gift we ever got?" Jackson looked at her, surprised and moved, as Haley and Harper nodded, smiling. "What?" he asked, pretending not to know the answer. "You," Hannah replied simply, with that sincerity so typical of children and preteens who still know how to say what they feel without fear or filter. And Jackson, with tears in his eyes, simply said, "And you are the greatest gift I've ever received. I've ever." In that moment, he had the full realization that despite not being there from their birth, he had managed to build something even more valuable, a relationship based on trust, presence, and love. The years to come would bring new challenges, adolescence, career choices, the natural changes that growth brings, but Jackson knew they were ready for it all, because they were a family. And as they walked together that Friday night through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, talking about the books they were reading, their new interests, plans for the next holidays, Jackson smiled with that silent peace of someone who knew at the right time to make the most important choice of his life. Yes, he had taken his time to find those three small figures hiding behind the oak tree in that silent cemetery, but when he did, he knew instantly that he would never let them go. And so amid laughter and stories they kept walking, leaving behind not just the shadows of the past, but, above all, building a luminous present, full of meaning, and a future that, Jackson was certain, would continue to be written with many hands, with the same love that had united them from the very first moment. And as they always said when finishing an important chapter of the list they created together, mission accomplished. Yes, mission accomplished.